face peeled away first. Not from a blow, not from poison, not from iron. The skin began to give way on its own, slowly in the evening light, when the king was no longer rising from his bed, but still whispering about sin, about a forgotten vow, about what he had not done. He knew he would be punished, but he did not think it would start with his face. King Henry, known as the Great Peacemaker, spent the last weeks of his life in the shadow of the old castle of Westmore, built on a cliff, surrounded by swamps and plague-ridden villages. The castle was chosen not by the will of the sovereign, but by necessity. His breathing became labored, and the skin under the doctor's hands felt hot, like burnt paper. At first, they thought it was fever, but the blood taken from his cut shoulder began to thicken right on the cloth. It smelled of honey and meat. He forgot his oath, the monks of Bridlewood later wrote, before the battle on Mount St. Maurice. He swore that if he survived, he would renounce the throne and retire to the quiet of a monastery. He survived, and he was crowned. His body began to fail on the third day of fasting. He did not eat, drink wine, or touch holy water. But even silence did not save him. His hands grew stiff, and his joints began to swell. Doctors rubbed them with onion mixtures and resin, but his fingers turned black. By nightfall, the king began to see his mother, Edith, who had died in agony when he was a child, in his dreams. He whispered her name, and then ordered all women to be expelled from his chambers. Even the queen. Westmoreland was filled with the smell of death. It did not come from the cellars, but from the bed itself. The servants were forbidden to keep meat, even dried fish or cheese. All this would have seemed justified were it not for one thing. The smell did not go away. The bodies were washed every evening with hot cloths, rosemary infusions, vinegar, and myrrh. But the skin peeled away from the neck and cheeks, even with the slightest touch. When Bishop Trevor entered the room, he couldn't help but hold his nose. The king looked at him with empty eyes. "You waited for me to die. Now smell my guilt." Henry croaked. "I gave you the relic, but I did not give you my flesh. Now it rots beneath your windows." The guards had changed. The old soldiers had been replaced by strangers, sergeants from the eastern garrison. They were paid with coins, not loyalty. They were forbidden to talk about what they saw at night, but they talked anyway, with drunken voices in taverns, where candles burned even during the day. They talked about how the king moaned not from pain, but from the smell of his own skin, about how he begged them to burn his face until it melted away, and about how someone, one night, finally tried. There were no traces of fire, but a servant named Aldrich disappeared. He was found in a well 3 days later, his stomach ripped open and a piece of burnt cloth in his fist. The fabric bore the king's coat of arms. When the king's face began to peel away completely, leaving streaks of pink slime on the pillows, the Archbishop of Canterbury arrived. He entered, barely turning around, and uttered, "The vow has been broken. The face has been removed." The servants standing by the walls swore that they did not understand these words, but one of them later hanged himself. Another went blind. Both were young. On the 8th day, a delegation arrived from France. They wanted confirmation that Henry was alive, that the decrees had been signed, and that he would change the line of succession. But no one let them into the room. The ambassadors stood in the audience chamber, where the old tapestry depicting his boar hunt still hung. A servant reported, "The king does not speak. The king is melting away." An internal report from the royal chancellery, preserved in the archives of York, states, "The physical integrity of the monarch is in doubt. His face is indistinguishable. His speech is incoherent. His consciousness is slipping. The signature on the decree is forged." When the 13th night came, it began to rain. It rained for 3 days. The palace, damp on all sides, began to smell like its sovereign. Pus dripped from the windows of the lower floor where the court priests had once prayed. One of the nuns who participated in washing the body later wrote in her letter, "He did not die. He was bleeding out, like a candle placed on meat. The flesh did not refuse. It dripped. We did not pray. We just carried buckets." From the third week of July, the smell in the chambers became unbearable. The servants, who were replaced every 2 candles, returned with dull eyes, not speaking to anyone. They were forced to rub the walls with vinegar and burnt resin, but the king's decaying skin did not respond to any oils. First, his hands began to fester. Blisters appeared between his fingers, bursting with a wet hiss, as if his body were boiling. Then his chin began to rot, exposing his gums, which no longer held his teeth. One of them fell into a plate of boiled fish when he last tried to eat without help. The court physician, a former barber in Westchester, declared that His Highness was suffering from deep rot caused by a broken vow or infection with mental fear. At a council meeting behind closed doors, the old archdeacon whispered of punishment for sacrilege. But the king, barely able to hear the voices through the fog that enveloped him after each loss of blood, looked through them. His eyelids had lost their strength. He had to blink with his hands. The records from July 22nd state his eyes were clouded over like a bull before slaughter. It was on the day that a white man came for the first time, an unknown stranger with a cross sewn into his hood. He did not introduce himself, but the abbot admitted him into the chambers because the king is calling not for a doctor, but for a father. The priest entered, sat down at the foot of the bed, and waited. According to the valet, the man remained silent for hours, watching as the king tore off the remains of his fingernails and pulled out the hairs from his chin. That same evening, a dog died in the corridor. The guards found that it had gnawed off its own paw. Then, for the first time, they decided to seal the windows. Rumors spread. The letters of Bishop Chichester record the words, "They keep him in swaddling clothes, as if he were a baby, and twice a day they wash the pus from his back. They rub him with salt, but the flesh continues to fester." One of the deacon brothers, called to pray for the dying man, later fled to Scotland. He claimed to have seen the skin peeling off the king's neck in whole flaps, as if someone had pulled a hood of flesh off him. This was also reported in the court chronicle attributed to the scribe Thomas More. The flesh comes off easily, like wax from hot iron. Underneath it is not blood, but blackness. Meanwhile, the struggle for the throne entered its decisive phase. Prince Edward left Northampton with 200 armed spearmen, but he was not allowed through the inner gates. The Queen began to have convulsions. Some said she had been poisoned. Amidst the decay of the king's body, his last will and testament was never revealed. The sealed documents were stolen or rewritten. 2 bishops argued in the chapel over who should read the funeral service, and both were later found with stony faces and broken fingers. Even the nuns attached to the royal hospital refused. "We do not serve a dead man who still speaks." Inside the castle, no one believed in a recovery anymore. As it later transpired, a wax figure with a cut-out mouth and empty eye sockets had been hidden under the king's pillow. It had been brought there shortly before the arrival of the strange priest. The valet, who later repented, claimed that someone wanted the king to lose his face while still alive, not after his death. At that moment, the smell became so thick that the crows sitting on the towers began to squawk and fall from the roofs. The royal chambers were glazed over with heat and stench. No one dared to enter without a vinegar bandage and a long robe. His internal organs began to fail, first his kidneys, then his intestines. For 3 days, he lay in his own excrement until his body began to fall into a state of immobile heat. It was as if someone had stirred the coals with a poker, wrote one of the observers. Then people began to say that the end was near, but no doctor would touch his body, fearing that the disease caused by his broken vow would be transmitted through the skin. And yet he continued to live. His face was no longer a face. His neck was covered with cracks, as if it had been raked, and only one eye, dull but open, watched everyone who approached. This eye, as one servant later wrote, was a black mirror. Those who thought about the throne looked into it. It was in this gaze that true horror was born. From the beginning of August, the castle stood in silence. No bells rang, no psalms were sung. Only the cries of crows and the occasional clanking of chains at the gates reminded us that inside, the one whose face had turned into a bloody rag was still breathing. He was called the Living Skull, and no one spoke the king's name anymore, not even in their prayers. His body was covered with small sores that oozed fluid, which congealed into a yellowish crust. His fingernails had fallen off. His lower lip had rotted away. It was not sweat that ran down his cheeks, but a dark, bloody film that smelled of wet wool and iron. Steam rose from his nose like from a blacksmith's bellows. The guards reported that every night a wet rattle could be heard coming from the chambers, as if someone were trying to breathe in ashes. The chronicler who remained at court wrote, "No man should see such a thing. He is not a man, he is penitent flesh. He has forgotten God, and God has forgotten him." The courtiers began to leave one by one. Some cited illness, others renounced their positions. Those who remained were bribed. One of the cooks who brought food disappeared, and was later found dead in a well. A note with a single word, "face," was stuffed down his throat. A new group of monks, summoned from the monastery of St. Clement, refused to pray near the chamber. They said that the air there was imbued with torment, and that even the devil himself could not bear the smell. The servants were then forced to smear the floors with fresh clay to absorb the secretions, but the fluid oozing from the body burned through the fabric. The mattress was changed daily. The sheets were changed 5 times a day. One of the servants, a young Irishman, stopped speaking after he saw the skin on the monarch's back peel away like a crust, exposing a ribbed arch crawling with white maggots. The official doctor disappeared. Rumors circulated that he had been imprisoned in a dungeon to prevent him from speaking. Instead, only a silent priest with a black bandage on his arm was allowed to visit the patient. He sat by the bed and, according to reports, did not utter a word for 9 days. His presence was oppressive. Even the crows no longer cawed. Anyone who entered the room felt as if they had entered a dungeon. It was damp, dark, and smelly. The windows were boarded up, and the candles went out by themselves. The scribe noted, "Vision disappears where he breathes." The queen did not leave her chambers. Once she was brought to him, she lost consciousness. She never fully recovered. She later died of exhaustion and terror. Her heirs tried to obtain an audience, but they were not allowed in. The king did not speak. He only stared. One eye was closed, the other still open. And when the youngest son entered the room, he bowed and backed out, trembling all over. He swore never to return. While the body continued to rot, disputes began outside the castle walls. Some had already declared the king dead. One of the bishops offered a prayer for the repose of his soul. He was executed. Edward's army approached the capital, but denied entry, withdrew. The people heard that the king was suffering, but no one knew the truth. Rumors spread through the streets. He had eaten the cursed flesh. He had broken his vow. He had killed the baby. He had sold his soul. Some claimed that he was not sick at all, but had taken on the form of a beast to atone for the sins of England. Meanwhile, a guard wearing an iron mask stood at the door of the chambers, replaced only at night. Only a wheezing sound could be heard inside. Then one day, according to reports, the wheezing stopped. The servants did not dare to enter. Only after a day, when the smell became so thick that it was impossible to breathe even through a bandage, did 3 men enter. They came out 2 minutes later, silent and in tears. One of them was found in the forest, hanged with his own belt. Another burned his hands. The third disappeared. Then, for the first time, people began to say that the body could not be removed. "He is still alive," said one of the older monks. He was silenced. Preparations began to close off the entire section of the castle. They decided to wall him up, but he was still breathing, and his eyes, those same black eyes, remained open. At night, the candle went out, and the guard standing at the door rushed down from the tower with a cry. The next day, the Pope's legate arrived in the city. He was not allowed to enter. His words are recorded in the report. "If there is still flesh living in this house, then the soul has long since left it. This is not a monarch. This is a vessel of wrath." And the king still lay there, faceless, with eyes that did not blink, with lips that did not utter a word, but understood everything, and even death did not dare to approach. 41 days. The palace was surrounded by silence, unbroken even by the wind. The curtains in the halls had rotted away, rags of fabric hanging like meat. Rats ran from the kitchen where food was still left, but no one took it. The smell spread throughout the neighborhood. It seeped through the cracks in the tiles, rose up the stone stairs, and soaked into the clothes. The priests said it was a signal to heaven, and began to pray for forgiveness without a body. The room where the king lay was covered with lime. It didn't help. The clay covering the walls cracked. Dark, greasy moisture dripped from the cracks. The surrounding rooms were sealed, boarded up, and chained. But at night, a damp rustling could still be heard from inside, as if someone was trying to turn over, with no bones or skin. No one went in. No one checked. Everyone knew he was there, neither alive nor dead. Abandoned, forgotten, rotting. The chronicler left a short note. "He decayed without dying." Another monk added, "The Lord turned away from him even before the pus began." The royal council met in secret. The body could not be buried. It could not be shown. It could not be touched. It was decided. The king was no more. His death was officially announced on the 43rd day. The date was backdated to avoid ceremonies. The document stated, "He died peacefully, surrounded by prayers." No one saw this. There was no burial. The chambers where the body lay were permanently sealed. The priest blessed the stone, but the candle went out. A greasy handprint remained on the wall. One of the scribes tried to wipe it off, but fainted. He was found later with a black mark on his forehead. The archbishop ordered the records relating to the last few weeks to be burned. The servants were sent to various monasteries. They were forbidden to speak. Those who saw what lay behind the door remained silent until their deaths. England was left without a monarch. A struggle began. There were two heirs, one recognized by the church, the other by the army. Riots broke out in the cities. The treasury was empty. Suspicions fell on the widowed queen, but she had already died. The archives disappeared. One of the monks was found strangled, with parchment stuffed in his mouth. The town criers refused to pronounce the name of the deceased. It was replaced with a symbol, a black circle on a white flag. It was said that if you pronounced his name near the palace wall, you would hear whispers, and those who heard them could no longer sleep. A few weeks later, envoys from France arrived to confirm the news. They were shown neither the body nor the coffin. They were shown only a report, signed by someone else, with the seal scratched off. One of them remarked, "This is not death. This is the expulsion of the body from life." He was forbidden to leave, and he disappeared. France severed diplomatic relations. The papal legate sent a letter saying, "If he rises, close the gates." There was no reply. A month after these events, one of the nuns claimed to have heard singing coming from under the floor. Fear spread among the people. People avoided the road to the palace. Priests forbade the lighting of candles. Some claimed that decay had spread throughout the city. The stones became damp, and the icons faded. The palace began to be demolished, but when the western wall was dismantled, A stream of steam smelling of honey and soap burst out. One of the workers began to laugh, then cried, then died. His skin was covered with blisters. The place was covered with lime. The king was never buried. Years later, his name was erased from the chronicles. The chronicles were deleted. Only an inscription remained in the temples. He made a vow and forgot. His image was no longer depicted. The only thing that remained was a shadow, burned into the stone in the chambers where he lay, and those who came closer felt the taste of rust on their tongues. The last person who remembered his face died in solitude. He said he saw it melt away, the skin peeling away from the bones, the teeth moving on their own, but even he did not dare to speak his name. The faceless king remained a curse on the era. His death did not bring peace, only fear and emptiness.